task force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Report. Content warning. Report contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. The report contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence. In addition, the number of months black students attended school was generally fewer than white students, e.g., 4 to 5 months in comparison to 6 to 8 months for white students. 9. The causes included lack of sufficient funding for schools in rural communities, where many African Americans lived, white farm owners forcing black children to work in the fields, or their sharecropping parents needing assistance. Limits on the number of months that a black school would be funded in comparison to a white school. 10. The inferior quality of black schools. Some prominent thinkers such as W.E.B. Du Bois suggested that integrated schools would ultimately disadvantage black students, because the discrimination they would inevitably continue to experience would prevent African Americans from receiving a proper education. 11. He wrote that separate schools were necessary for the proper education of the Negro race. 2. Moreover, he believed that race prejudice in the United States was such that most Negroes cannot receive a proper education in white institutions, because the proper education of any group of people required sympathy, understanding, social equality between teachers and their students. 113. 14 article in The Atlantic. Ta-Nehisi Coates recounts the story of Clyde Ross, a student who was encouraged to attend a more challenging black school outside of his community built with funds from a philanthropist and resources amassed by black community members. Also donated physical labor to actually build the schools. 114. The school was too far away from his home for him to walk there and get back in time to work in the fields. Children had a school bus, but Ross and other black children did not. Thus, Ross lost out on the opportunity for a better education. 115. For many black students, the school that Ross was encouraged to attend was the first ever available to them in their community. Yet another way, African Americans paid twice. They devoted funds and their own labor to build a school for their children while also paying taxes that supported better schools for white students. In spite of concerted state efforts to deny them equal educational opportunities, black Southerners achieved a literacy rate of 43% by 1890. A growth that far surpassed the rise of literacy in Spain and Italy during the same period, and that continued to rise in nearly all Southern states in the early 1900s. 116. Yet, researchers have found that the legacies of slavery, compounded by the many obstacles that black children faced in acquiring education, show a correlation with high rates of illiteracy among African Americans nearly 80 years after slavery ended. 117. Resistance to integration. 1951. Black students led the fight for desegregation. 118. And, in 1954, the Supreme Court declared race-based segregation in public schools unconstitutional in its Brown v. Board of Education decision. 19. Although many Americans believed that the Supreme Court's Brown decision was the end of school segregation, it was not. After the Brown decision, all across the country, many white Americans and white state and local governments refused to implement the court's order, while the federal government failed to adequately enforce the order and protect black teachers, school administrators, and students. An unequal education. Former enslaving states, white-controlled government school boards, and state and municipal governments almost universally refused to comply with Brown in what historians have called the era of massive resistance. 120. On May 12, 1956, 90% of the South's congressional delegation signed the Southern Manifesto, pledging to fight integration using any means at their disposal. 21. These lawmakers and others in Southern states made good on their promise. Americans in the South used violence, harassment, and threats to stop integration. They attacked black students and terrorized some black families who dared to enroll their children in white public schools. Example, in Arkansas, on September 4, 1957, when 9 black students went to enroll in Little Rock's all-white Central High School. Governor Orville Faubus ordered the Arkansas National Guard to form a blockade around the school's front door to keep the students out. No. For the advancement of colored people. ACP had to get a federal court order to make the National Guard stand down. Even with the court's order, the students were still not safe to enter because of the threat of white mob violence. Only after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sent a plea for protection to President Eisenhower did the federal government act. The government brought in 1,000 Army paratroopers and ordered the National Guard to provide an escort for the students as they entered the school. 1 days after the 9 black students, now known as the Little Rock Nine, first tried to attend the high school, they were finally able to enter. They walked in. Angry white crowds of students and adults yelled racial insults and threw objects at them. Allow integration to go forward in other schools, Governor Faubus closed all public high schools in Little Rock for the 1958 to 1959 school year. 122 throughout their time in the school. The Little Rock Nine reported enduring severe harassment, including physical violence from some white students. Several years later, on the eve of graduation, the home of Carlotta Walls, one of the Little Rock Nine, was bombed by white supremacists. 123. Mississippi, when then NAACP civil rights attorney Derek Bell filed a lawsuit to integrate one community's schools. He described how nightriders came through the community firing guns into black homes. 24 African Americans who signed petitions to integrate the schools lost their jobs or had their credit cut off by merchants. 25 Because of the severe intimidation and harassment by the white community, only one black family was ultimately willing to send their child to the white school. 26 When the child, Deborah, arrived at school, a large crowd jeered and marshals had to escort her into the school. 127 Deborah's father lost his job the same day, and white Americans attempted to burn their house down. 28 Southern states also passed laws to close both white and black public schools, deny state money for any schools that integrated, and provided vouchers or freedom of choice to over 3,000 newly created private schools for white students. 129 For several years, black students in certain areas in the South had no school to attend at all. 130 In Georgia, Governor Herman Talmadge, who opposed public school integration, told the public at a press conference that the only solution to a public school segregation ban was abolition of the public school system. 131. The Supreme Court also contributed to the slow progress of desegregation. When asked to decide how quickly school districts across the country must desegregate, the Supreme Court answered that schools could do so with all deliberate speed. 132 One federal judge who heard cases filed by African Americans challenging the failure to desegregate schools for almost 10 years concluded that the effect of the Supreme Court's decision was to sacrifice individual and immediate vindication of the newly discovered right of blacks to a desegregated education in favor of a remedy more palatable to whites. 133. All of these government acts, legal school segregation in many places in the South continued into the 1960s, and little desegregation of schools took place. 34 In 5 Deep South states, 4 million black school children continued to attend a segregated school until the fall of 1960, when integration efforts finally began. 35. Mass firings of black educators. Federal government and court failure to adequately enforce the Brown v. Board of Education decision had other negative consequences. 36 Southern states engaged in en masse firing of black teachers and administrators without cause to prevent a white administrator and teacher with the same or overlapping position as a black administrator or teacher at the newly integrated school from losing their job. 137 In 1955, a federal government staff attorney responded to the firing of black teachers, stating that, in a war, there must be some casualties, and perhaps the black teachers will be the casualties in the fight for equal education of black students. 138. Educator affected by the told researchers that in his community, the Teachers College for African Americans was closed in the name of integration, and many of the professors who taught there were required to go teach in the high schools. The president of the black college was given a central office do-nothing position, and then someone with a master's degree, a white high school principal, was named president of the newly desegregated Teachers College. 139. Hiring of black educators deeply affected the economic, social, and cultural structure of the black community because many middle-class black people served in education. 40. It is estimated that black communities lost millions of dollars as a result. In 1970-71, the black community in 17 southern states lost an estimated $240 million in salaries. 141. Mass firings also have had long-standing repercussions, as the presence of black principals and superintendents remained disproportionately low across America in relation to the number of black public school students. 142 studies show that students who have teachers who look like them do better in school than those who do not. Black students with at least one black teacher by third grade are 13% more likely to graduate high school and 19% more likely to enroll in college than black students who had no black teachers. 143. However, about 80% of teachers and principals and 90% of superintendents nationwide are white. 144. Black teachers represent just 7% and black male teachers represent just 2% of the teaching force. 145. Yet 15% of public school students are black students. 146. Many black students will go through their educational careers without having a black teacher. And implemented tools to segregate schools, whereas in the South, legal segregation laws prohibited black students from attending schools with white students. In the rest of the country, government actors largely used different but nearly as effective tools. Create segregated schools for black students with less funding and resources. First, federal, state and local housing segregation policies, including redlining and restrictive covenants as described in Chapter 5, Housing Segregation, forced the vast majority of African Americans to live in separate communities from white Americans. 147. School and government officials then assigned black and white students to attend different schools based on where they lived. In this way, segregated schools were created and maintained. Schools that black students attended then received less funding and resources than the schools that white students attended. Occurred because public schools generally obtained a large portion of money from local property taxes raised within the city where the schools were located. Result: the amount of funding for the school district and school depended on how much could be raised by taxes in each local, segregated community. Expense of the properties in a school district, the more money a school district receives. Federal government along with private actors devalued black-owned properties. Through redlining, they also locked black students into schools that received far less funding for their schools than the white families in nearby neighborhoods with a higher property tax base. 148. Students with at least one black teacher by third grade are 13% more likely to graduate high school and 19% more likely to enroll in college than black students who had no black teachers. 116. 6. Separate and unequal education. Schools outside of the South were also segregated by law for a number of years after the Civil War. For example, segregated schools were not banned until 1920 in New York City. 49. In general, the quality of education received by black students in these segregated schools was not equal to the quality of education received by white students, because schools largely attended by black students were underfunded and provided with fewer resources. 50. After the Brown v. Board of Education decision, highly segregated schools fostered through official actions, government-implemented housing segregation and school district boundary and assignment policies, also remained largely the rule. 151. White protests against integration, including some that involved violence against African Americans integrating schools, occurred in different places across the country. For example, in February of 1964, after 460 black and Puerto Rican students and their parents called on the New York City Board of Education to integrate majority student of color schools that were so overcrowded they operated on split shifts, with the school day lasting only 4 hours for students. So underfunded that they had inferior facilities and less experienced teachers. 15,000 white New York parents staged a counter-protest. 152. Milton Galamison, a civil rights activist and pastor of Siloam Presbyterian Church in Bedford-Stuyvesant, who helped lead the protest to integrate the schools, stated, "Nobody can do these children more harm than these children are being done every day in this public school system." 53. United States Commission on Civil Rights 1967 study, Racial Isolation in Public Schools, confirmed the nationwide problem, finding that violence against black continues to be a deterrent to school desegregation. 154. The report also found that black children suffer serious harm when they must attend racially segregated schools, whatever the source of that segregation might be. 55. 68. the Kerner Commission warned President Lyndon Johnson that the nation was moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Result of height racism and white supremacist institutions. 56 After a short period of active coordinated federal effort to enforce desegregation rights from 1965 to 1969, the Nixon administration curtailed enforcement of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. 57 By the 1980s, roughly half of the nation's children of color resided in the 20 or 30 largest school districts. 158 in urban areas, white Americans continued to fight vehemently against integration. In Boston, schools that served black children were poorly equipped and understaffed, and badly underfunded. Received about two-thirds the amount of funding received by schools in white neighborhoods. 59 In 1974, after black families filed suit and a court ordered the city to desegregate its schools, white mobs threw bricks, bottles, and eggs at buses carrying black students to majority white schools, injuring 9 children. 160. Americans moved into the suburbs, redlining, restrictive covenants, and even violence prevented many African Americans from doing the same. School district officials drew their boundaries at the city and suburb line, which ensured that black students living in the inner city would be required to attend inner city schools, while white children living in the suburbs attended suburban schools. Major school districts in cities, unless a court desegregation order was in place, districts continued to assign students to schools based on the schools in their neighborhoods. Because the neighborhoods remained segregated by race, the schools continued to be segregated, too. Segregation in housing by federal and local government actors and the drawing of school district boundaries to mirror school segregation and funding inequities was well known and documented. In 1974, when black parents asked the Supreme Court to order 53 suburban school districts to participate in the desegregation of the predominantly black and very under-resourced Detroit city school system, the court said no. 61 Because the Supreme Court refused to address the government-supported residential segregation that forced African Americans to attend a small subset of American schools, integration was stopped at the city-suburb line. 62 Today, the Detroit city school system remains segregated, approximately 80% black, and severely underfunded and under-resourced. 63. In 1977, the Supreme Court made it difficult to challenge neighborhood zoning rules, which made it difficult for African Americans to move into largely white residential areas. 164 Professor Derek Bell noted that the federal government and local governments created racially isolated communities, which in turn created single-race schools, and then the Supreme Court insulated these schools from court challenges. Actively enforcing desegregation from 1965 to 1969, the federal government reduced enforcement of the Civil Rights Act under President Nixon. By the 1980s, roughly half of the nation's children of color resided in the 20 or 30 largest school districts. 165 After these Supreme Court opinions, lower court judges began to declare school districts desegregated even when the percentage of black students increased after white Americans moved to the suburbs aided by housing policies that continued to discriminate against African Americans. 166 In general, these federal courts would not find that it was against the law for black students to attend schools that received far less funding and had far fewer resources than those schools attended mostly by white students. 67. Late 1980s, which was considered the peak of integration, schools remained or were returning to being predominantly white and predominantly non-white. 68 10 years later things had gotten worse. On July 17, 2001, Harvard University's Civil Rights Project published a study concluding that school districts across the nation had resegregated or were resegregating at an alarming rate, particularly in the South. 169 The study linked this resegregation to a series of Supreme Court cases decided in the early 1990s, which made it easier for school districts to remain segregated. 70. In 2007, the Supreme Court eliminated school districts' ability to use certain types of voluntary local desegregation plans. 171 5 years later a study found that school segregation across the nation was substantially worse than at the high point of desegregation in 1988, and that the typical black student was in a school where almost 2 out of every 3 classmates, 64%, are low income. Nearly double the level of schools of the typical white or Asian student. 172. The last 5 years continue to find that segregated and unequally resourced schools remain the reality for the vast majority of black students and other students of color. 173. However, they also note the extraordinary gains that black students have made, in spite of remaining in segregated and unequally funded and resourced schools. Brown decision. Less than a fourth of black students had graduated from high school. Now about 9/10 of black students are graduating. 74. Nonetheless, for African Americans to ever attain academic justice, emphasis should be placed not just on the number of African Americans receiving an education, but rather on the quality and content of the education received. By Carter G. Woodson, if the education being provided to African Americans is of the wrong kind, the increase in numbers of educated African Americans will be a disadvantage rather than an advantage. 175. Tracking. Brown versus Board of Education. In districts and schools that were marginally integrated, black students faced segregation by other means. School officials were more likely to place black students into special education programs and inferior vocational, non-diploma, and alternative school tracks than white students. School officials were more likely to place white students into gifted or accelerated programs than black students. This is where educators group students by what they view as the student's abilities is commonly referred to as tracking. 176. Studies have shown that tracking, which continues today, is correlated with race. 177 and eliminates the benefits of integration for black students, like access to college classes and high-quality curriculum. 78. Explain that teachers, the vast majority of whom are white, function as primary gatekeepers in gifted and talented identification, and are less likely to refer black students for gifted programs than white students with similar levels of academic achievement. 79 Black students tracked out of the mainstream program are often resegregated in another classroom within the school or in a setting in another school location. 80 Those placed in lower tracks do not receive the same quality of education. They often receive less resources and opportunities. 81. October 12, 2021 Task Force hearing. Professor Rucker Johnson testified to the harms of segregation within schools, including harm to students' health, mental health, school success, and income growth, telling. July 17, 2001, Harvard University's Civil Rights Project published a study concluding that school districts across the nation had resegregated or were resegregating at an alarming rate, particularly in the South. The study linked this resegregation to a series of Supreme Court cases decided in the early 1990s, which made it easier for school districts to remain segregated. 18. Chapter 6. Separate and Unequal Education. Panel. Often even when we see what look like diverse schools there are segregated classrooms, and racialized tracking. 82.